Hello, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest Great Lakes area agronomist, and welcome back for another edition of the Golden Harvest Agronomy In Action podcast. Now, today is July the 31st, and it's been another mixed bag of weather. Though most all of our area needed a rain, the totals were somewhat scattered. Here in the Lansing area, I got 0.3 of an inch total, whereas other areas reported as much as 1.6 inches. Now, with the corn tasseling and the soybeans flowering, I'm really hoping for some more rain pretty soon here. Now, maybe the forecasted rain this weekend will do the trick, but traveling across mid-Michigan earlier in the week, I found way too many cornfields just showing some serious signs of drought, and even some that were so bad the corn looked brown and dead. So I'm afraid for those folks, maybe no amount of rain this weekend is going to help. But this week on the podcast, let's talk about a couple of different things. First off, soybean cyst nematodes, a little bit on how to identify and manage them, and sudden death syndrome that, and what causes it and how to manage it too. So, grab your cup of coffee and let's talk agronomy. So, my most interesting service call this week was not actually a service call at all, but just a farm visit to check on how the crops are doing and to see if there was anything that needed to be addressed between now and harvest. I was in southeast Michigan, and for the most part, the crops were actually looking really good. They've gotten a few more rains than the areas further north, and, I really wasn't expecting to find anything of concern. But of course, I walk into a field, I always try to take a shovel with me, and this trip was no different. As we walked into what looked like a truly beautiful field of soybeans and dug up some of the roots, that's when the tone of the day changed quite quickly. Though the general structure of the roots looked good, we soon noticed a heavy pressure of soybean cyst nematodes. Now, for those of you who may not have seen SCN in person, boy, the cysts on the roots, they kind of look like cream-colored nodules, but they're only about 1/10 of the size of a nodule. Now, to find them on your roots yourself, the key is to first just dig some roots, gently shake off the soil, and then you got to let the roots dry in the air for about 20 to 30 seconds. Now, if you have SCN on your roots, boy, these cysts will just all of a sudden just start to appear on the roots. Now, because the weather had been pretty good in that area this summer, and the fertility was really excellent in these fields, there really wasn't any foliar symptoms yet from the cyst population below the ground. But when fields with SCN maybe are more dry or under stress, these areas of high cyst populations then start to show up as areas of, what looks like greater drought stress. But of course, the first question from this farmer was, so what do I do now? And, that is what I want to spend the next few minutes discussing on the podcast here. So, first off, there is nothing we can do for this year. The cysts are already there, and there's just no rescue treatment for SCN. Now, the second thing we need to do is to take some soil samples from all of your fields and, send them into your local university and have them do an SCN test to determine the level of infection you have in your soils. The good news is that, you can do this at any time of the year, and they're going to send you back a report outlining how many SCN eggs you have per cubic centimeter soil, and it's going to give you an infection rating level, as well as a recommendation of how many years that field might better remain out of soybean production. Now, based on this data, we can have a better conversation on how to manage each field. Now, the third thing we want to do is to put together a plan for next year. When we come back to soybeans in any of your fields, we'll probably want to consider rotating our mode of SCN protection. If you've been planting soybeans with that PI 88788 trait for years, you might want to highly consider planting a soybean with the Peking trait and, vice versa. Now, I would also highly recommend treating those soybeans with an effective seed treatment that's, really designed to help manage SCN and sudden death syndrome. So just give me or your Golden Harvest sales rep a call, and we can discuss some very specific product recommendations, both for the soybean trait and the seed treatment needed. Now, the real challenge is that the only real way to beat SCN is to work on reducing their populations every year. And that's either through crop rotation to a non-host crop or, the use of trait rotation and effective seed treatments, because we know these cysts, they can remain dormant in the soil for 10 years or more. Now, the next thing we saw was sudden death syndrome. It was starting to show up in one of his more heavily SCN-infested fields, and we noticed that iconic leaf with the green veins and the kind of dead plant tissue in the area between the veins. And, we did what we always need to do. We cut open the stem down near the soil line to ensure that it was SDS, because we know that those same foliar symptoms could have also meant maybe brown stem rot or, even the newer red crown rot. Now, what we found inside the stems was a clean white center vein, and it was surrounded by the woody tissue that was starting to get a little bit of a gray cast to it. Now, if the center vein was brown, then it would have been brown stem rot. And, if the outside of the stem was red, or we happen to see those red fruiting bodies on the outside of the stems, then we might have considered having it tested for red crown rot. But the relationship between soybean cyst nematode and sudden death syndrome is pretty common. Now, when you have the cysts that, they're running an entire generation in about 21 days, and, when those cysts, they break away from the roots to then, of course, reinfest the surrounding soil, well, they leave behind a wound in that root that can, now allow for fusarium to enter into the root. And the fusarium then is the causal agent for sudden death syndrome. Now, as far as managing SDS, again, there is no rescue treatment. So we need to focus on selecting for variety tolerances and, again, using an effective seed treatment. Now, we've got both, and we're glad to have these management conversations as we really start to plan for next year's crop. So, what's the takeaway from this customer call this past week? Well, it's a reminder that we can have SCN even if we don't know it. Now, to find out, you need to get out there and dig some roots and look for them. They are visible to the naked eye if you just take the time to look. Now, once you see them, get your soil tested to see the level of risk, and then let us help you manage these fields for next year. There's a light at the end of this tunnel, and it doesn't have to be an oncoming train, if we just plan and then work that plan. So, to wrap up this week's episode, remember, 1, the first step in managing soybean cyst nematode is realizing that we have a problem. Then taking the SCN test and putting together a management plan based on those results. And 2, sudden death syndrome. It's now starting to show up on soybeans across the area. If you see it and confirm it, then you probably also need to be checking for cyst nematodes. Managing these to, just think about managing these challenges together. It's a step in the right direction. So I want to thank you again for tuning into this week's Golden Harvest Agronomy in Action podcast. Stay patient, stay safe, and I'll see you in the field.